Need an inner cover for your beehive? Maybe you need to feed some hungry bees and you want to be able to change those feeders without opening up the hive. Going to talk about it, show you how to make it, and another option coming up. I'm Roger and welcome to the shop, and what I'm going to be covering here are inner covers for your beehive, and I make them for both my 5-frame nukes and the standard 10-frame Langstroth. Just common inner cover. It's even got the slot in it for, I generally use it as a handle. It's really designed for a porter bee escape, but I don't really know of anybody that uses those anymore. We're going to cover how to make one of these. The main part of this video is going to be how to make one of these inner covers where you can put 4 quart mason jars on it, which would be a gallon of syrup, plus have room for pollen patties underneath. Be able to have this on your hive, have it set there. You could come up to the hive from the back. You don't need to put the veil on, suit up or anything, no gloves. Take the telescoping cover off. This all fits inside a medium super box. Pop these off. Refill them or put some new ones on that are already filled. Set them back in place and you're done. Don't have to open the hive. If you're changing the pollen patty, obviously you'd need to lift this, but because there are provisions for it. The whole secret behind this is this 1/8" hardware cloth screen that is on the bottom side of this, and this is a dual depth cover, just the same as the regular cover here. In general practice, you would have the deep side up and this on your hive for proper bee space. If you're going to be feeding pollen patties, or you want to say you're putting Formic Pro or something on top of the hive, on top of the frames, then you could invert it like this. But you don't want to leave it that way because the bees will damn sure build comb and attach your cover to the frames. I had that happen already when I forgot to turn one over. But we're going to get into the build on this, and another little option with using one of these with a regular inner cover that'll come on towards the end. So let's get on with the build. Simple mason jar. This lid is punched with a bunch of little tiny holes, and you can either punch your own. The holes need to be tinier, the thing will leak. But what I found is these lids you can buy from Data for 80 cents a piece, so I'm not going to screw around punching holes. So this will handle 2 mason jars. The advantage of using the mason jars is they're common, they're not hard to come by. Throw a little trivia at you here, and maybe you're going to be on Jeopardy someday, or you need to know a little bit of trivia. The mason jar was not named after Perry Mason, and if you don't know who Perry Mason is, you either need to ask your dad or probably your grandfather if you're really young, because you're not going to have any idea who Perry Mason was. Anyway, the jars were invented by a guy named John Mason in 1858, and he actually invented the lid first. Back then they were sealing jars with just a combination of some wax and whatever jar they could find to use. And he came up with the idea of having a lid, and it was originally a zinc lid with a rubber ring that went around it. And I do have some, I don't have any out here right now. The 2-piece lid that you see was invented by the Kerr Corporation, not Ball and not by John Mason. That was something that came later on in the early 1900s. At any rate, John Laird Mason invented the mason jar in 1858. He had it patented in 1859. However, it didn't really catch on right away, and even though he had a patent on it, that patent expired in 1879. When it did expire, the Ball Corporation, who I'm sure a lot of people have heard of, because they've been making jars for years and they're still in business, took over and started making the jars. So you'll see a lot of Ball jars, and if they're actually a collector's item, some of the older ones, and you can tell the age of them by the trademark and the insignia on the front. Anything you see on the bottom is not a date, it's just actually a mold number. These jars here happen to be Kerr. Actually, there are two different vintages here. I don't know if you can see that or not, but I don't have the chart out here, but you can actually see what year they were made by looking at the trademarks and how they were made. At any rate, these jars are easy to come by. You can either buy a new, you can find them at yard sales, estate sales, garage sales, all over the place. You may even have some in your basement. If you have some of the blue ones made by Ball, those are collector's items, and it's probably not a good idea to be using them for sugar syrup on your hives. If you have a green one, that's even rarer, and you'll probably be looking to maybe sell that on eBay or Marketplace or someplace. If you happen to have some of the amber ones from way back in the early 1900s, you don't want to put them on your beehive. You want to have them at an auction or on eBay or someplace. They are worth a lot of money. At any rate, I digress. We'll get back to the build here. I'll show you how I lay these out and how they're built. Okay, these can be used as either an inner cover or an in-hive feeder, and I'm actually doing both, but it takes exactly the same process to build these. You'll need some 3/4 inch pine, that's all I'm using here. It's ripped down to 1 1/4 wide. Your side rails are 19 1/8 long. Your end pieces will be 16 1/4 long. We'll be putting a 3/4 by 3/8 rabbet on each end and a 1/4 inch dado down through the center of all of these, a 1/4 inch back, and I'll get into details on that. This way you'll be able to set that inner cover or feeder depending on how you build it. If I'm building it as a feeder, I will have the narrow side down with the feeder side up, and you'll understand that when I get into making the holes and putting the jars in, etc. If you're using this as an inner cover, you can put this side down. It gives you the proper amount of bee space underneath. If you're, let's say you're putting a pollen patty on top of the frames, you can flip this over and you get this extra 5/8 of an inch or so room there for the thickness of your pollen patty. I wouldn't leave the cover on like this because the bees will build comb between the top of the frame and the inner cover, and then when you take the inner cover off, you have a mess. Okay, the inner part of this, you can either use plywood or I'm using masonite because I've just got a whole bunch of it. This is 19 1/8 by 15 1/2. That's the measurements of that. And if you're going to use it as an inner feeder, we'll be making holes in this to put the jars in, and I'll be showing that here shortly. Or if you're just going to make it an inner cover, you can cut the slot here like they all have, and I'll give the dimensions of that. This one's a little messed up because this was my template and I wasn't watching what I was doing, and as you can see from this big mark and this jagged edge, I actually dropped it down on the router bit on the table, so it kind of messed it up. So I got to make a new one of these. Okay, the way these go together, and I'll do it before I make my holes here. The masonite slides into that dado, sides like so, and your side pieces should be exactly the same length as the plywood or masonite. When your end goes on, so here, this rabbet will come over the edge of this like so. And it'll look like this when you've got everything put together. Obviously I don't want to glue and staple this yet because I want to make all my holes first, but this gives you an idea. But for here, this is where you can make the decision whether you want it to be an inner cover or if you want it to be a feeder cover. If you want this to be an in-hive feeder inner cover, then you would have your holes here and for the mason jars, and I'm going to get into that here directly. Okay, and your pieces that are 16 1/4 long, which would be the ends, we're going to need to make a rabbet on the end that is 3/8 of an inch deep and in 3/4 of an inch. And a good way to do this, well, there's a lot of ways to do it. If you have a dado setup, dado, whichever side of the tracks you're from, you can do it in just one pass. But I'll show you a way to do it if you don't have that. These are 16 1/4, so I'm using my crosscut sled. So I set this to 15 1/2, and I'll be able to quickly cut that 3/8 deep slot on each end right here. I've got my blade set up 3/4 of an inch high, or 3/8 of an inch high, rather. And just flip it end for end. If you don't have a crosscut sled, and not everybody does, you can also use your miter gauge to hold it in. And if you happen to have one of these saws with the little circle in the center here, you can make a pencil mark as a reference. Some saws have them, some don't. It's an old Craftsman, it does. And I still use that occasionally. Now the next thing you need to do is be able to cut the rest of this out. And there's a couple ways you could do it. One is if you have an auxiliary fence on the fence of your table saw, you can stand this straight up and clamp it to it. Or, well, you can't clamp it to it because you wouldn't be able to move it. But you would be able to push this along the blade with the blade raised up 3/4 of an inch. If you don't have an auxiliary fence to make it tall, don't do that because that's extremely dangerous. Another way to do it is to make multiple passes. And I'll do one here just to kind of give you an idea how this is done. Just keep making multiple passes through the blade until you get back to where your original cut is. Then you'll end up with a rabbet on the end like this. I'll do the other end here quick. The rest of these I'm going to do with my table saw fence. I'll show you how that's done here in a minute. And here we have one of our end pieces. Okay, to do this safely, you absolutely have to have an auxiliary fence, which is much higher than the normal fence, like I have on here. And you also need a zero clearance insert around your blade, because when you're trying to pass this past that blade, if you've just got that wide slot there, this could drop and this thing could come flying back at you. So if you don't have that kind of setup, then do like I did on the previous method there by making multiple passes. Or if you have a dado set, put the dado set in, set it at 3/4 and do it in one pass. I could have done that here, but I've only got 6 pieces to cut, so I wasn't going to fool around doing the dado. And I also wanted to show how this will work. Okay, we already have our pieces cut here with the original cut back 3/4 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch deep. Now you set your blade up just shy of 3/4 of an inch out, and you want to set the fence away from the blade 3/8 of an inch, and you can make the cuts like this. So this is the one I did with the, by making multiple passes. This is the one I did just now on the table saw. That's just another way to do it, but as I mentioned before, you have to have a tall auxiliary fence, and you pretty much have to have a zero clearance insert around your blade. That big gap, this could drop down in there, and the blade will grab that, and it'll just send it flying. So don't take a chance. If you're uneasy about it at all, either put a dado set in or make the multiple passes like I did before. You also want to stay out of the line of fire. When these little pieces come off of there, the blade could catch one of them and knock you in the noggin. So keep that in mind too while you're doing this. Okay, and just like that, we've got all our end pieces cut. Okay, for making this hole in the center, actually you kind of use it for a handle. It was originally designed for the old style Porter B escape. I don't use them, but it is handy to have this for a handle on an inner cover, or for extra ventilation with the feeder style that we're going to be getting into. What this is, I don't know if this will focus in or not on this, but I do have layout lines on here. You find the center both directions. This slot needs to be 3.5 inches long and 1.25 inches wide. So what I did was I used a Forstner bit at each end, 1.25 inches, and then I cut between them with a jigsaw. And then you just need to go through and make sure your edges are nice and smooth and perfect, especially if you're going to be doing what I'm going to be doing here in a minute with a router table and using this as a template, because whatever defect you have in here will be on your next piece too, because it'll make an exact copy. So what I do for this is I have a well, they call it a bottom bearing bit, but because it's in the router table pointing up, it's actually at the top, and that's a little bearing here, and this will follow the pattern here after I bore a hole in this. So what I do, take a couple pieces of, and they don't need to be real big, a couple pieces of double-sided tape here, one on each end. And the fun part's getting the backing off sometimes. One thing to be aware of is this does make a lot of dust. I'm only doing a couple here, or otherwise I'd put my fence up there with the dust collector hose on it. Well, I guess that wouldn't work too well here, but I would try to have a hose up here somewhere, because this kicks up a lot of dust. I do have a dust collector built into the bottom of this table, but since it kicks most of the dust up and not down, you get dust everywhere. So what you want to do after you get your double-sided tape on there is get your corners lined up perfect. Like so. And you'll need to drill a hole here to have access for your router bit to come through. This bit's a little big for this, for what I'm doing, but it'll work. It's just a matter of placing this in here and following your pattern. Did I mention it makes a lot of dust? You just pop your pieces apart. Template. There's a new one. It's got a little bit of fuzzies on it, but you can knock that off with a rasp or a file real easy. It's a little better from this side. Then you just take the tape off, and you can either use it on the next piece or throw it away and put new tape on the next one. Okay, now for the feeder cutout. So this here is an example, and this one is used. Not like the ones you saw in the little bit of trivia I did earlier. The top of the lid right here, this measures 2 3/4 inch across. So for that, I'll be using a 2 3/4 inch hole saw. And I'll be doing it in the drill press here. What I've done is I've laid out, and I know you're not going to be able to see this because it's black on brown, but with a pencil, I've come in 4 inches from each direction on all 4 corners. And I will use that cross point as a center point to drill my holes with the hole saw, and I'll be sticking 3 of these together so I can do 3 at once. Okay, and there we have it. Got all the holes drilled. Okay, you got some holes made. Should look something like this. And if you would take one of these here jars, fits in there, nice and snug, just like that. So the next step will be to be putting that frame together. And I'm going to move these jars before I knock them off and break them, because John Mason would be mad if I did that. Okay, the assembly is pretty straightforward. I'm using Tight Bond 3, which is a waterproof glue. And I'm using 1.5 inch galvanized staples, which will go through the ends. Okay, so the way I do this, I start with the sides, and it's not you don't necessarily have to glue the sides. I do, because they are held pretty captive. I don't get real wild with spreading glue in there. I just put a nice little bead down through there. Try not to get it all over. And just pop that right over the, a little bit of squeeze out on the end, that's fine. I'll flip that over. Do the other long side. One thing you want to make sure you don't make a mistake here and put the deep side opposites of each other. I've done stupid stuff like that before. And if you've got everything cut right, everything should come out just perfect there. So now you'd want to take one of your ends, slip a little bead down through the center there. And on the ends I take a little more care. I do some spreading and I make sure I get it on both surfaces. And yes, I use my finger. I know it freaks some people out, but I can sit and watch TV later tonight and peel the glue off my fingers. That's entertaining. Just pop that on the end there. And you'll end up looking something like so. And you'll do the exact same thing on the other end. Get your glue spread on there good, get all the surfaces covered. Okay, you want to make sure you got everything good and tight all the way around. If all the joints were cut right, everything should fit well. You should end up with something that looks like this. And I just put 2 staples in each corner, one from each direction. Yeah, got a blowout there, but I can fix that. That's one of the reasons you don't want to put your hand over there where you're driving a staple. If you get a blowout or you get one that curled up like that one did, it'll go right into your hand. Sure everything's down in there good and tight. And you have a frame. Now if you were doing the inner cover without the feeder holes, it would be exactly the same procedure, just wouldn't have these extra holes. So I'm going to get my other things put together here and then we'll put the screen on it. Okay, next up would be to put the screen in, and I've cut a piece of what they call 1/8" hardware cloth. Some people call it number 8 mesh. It's what it is. It's a heavy screen with 1/8" holes, square holes. So depends where you are, what they're going to call it. And I put this in on the deeper side of the cover. The reason being that it leaves me space in the center here if I want to put a pollen patty in and still have the feeder jars on the top side. So then I just use 1/4" staples. This stuff's always fun because it wants to curl. Starting with the corners. Then I add staples around where the jars are going to set. In case that lid should happen to push through, it won't make the screen sag. And when you're done, it'll look like this. So when you put your feeder jars in there, I'll grab one, and it comes time to change them, you don't necessarily need to put a veil on and everything. If you come up to the hive from the back, you can just lift off the telescoping cover, and this all fits inside a medium super box, obviously without the frames. And you could either leave that super box in place and just pop these out and swap them, or you could take that off, I suppose, if you wanted to. I never do. This is a great way to feed bees in the spring and in the early fall if you need to do some feeding without having to open up the whole hive or disturb them or anything. I've got one other option too that can be used with the regular inner cover, and I'll get to that in just a second. Okay, here's another type of feeder that can be used. This is called Bee Smart. No, I'm not sponsored by them. It's beesmartdesigns.com. Picked one of these up earlier in the year to try it out, and it works real well. You mix your syrup up. This bottom here unscrews. Mix your syrup up, put it in there, and it's important to fill it up. Don't do it half full, or when you invert it, you're going to have problems. If you get it clear full, screw the bottom back on here. Well, maybe. Then when you invert it, you'll get a couple little drips at first, and then it'll work just like with the bell jar theory. It'll hold that vacuum up in there, and there's little holes down here in the bottom where the bees can come and get their syrup. This works well on an inner cover like this, just your regular standard inner cover. And if you put your inner cover in this way with the shallow side up, you can put a pollen patty on each side or one side or the other. Then you can set this feeder on top. A medium super box covers the whole thing. Works out perfect. Just another option I thought I'd kind of point out. And once again, not sponsored by this beesmartdesigns.com, but I like this. I'll probably get a couple more if I can remember where I got it. Obviously, I guess I could go to their website and find out. So that's how I make my in-hive feeders. Granted, this is not going to be for everybody. Yeah, you can buy in-frame feeders. You just drop in place of a frame. There's lots of other different styles. This is something you can make yourself if you like. It's overly difficult, and I've kind of oversimplified it possibly for some of you more advanced woodworkers that are also beekeepers. But this is a great solution. You don't have any robbing this way. I really don't like open feeding because you're not only feeding your bees, you're feeding feral bees and whatever other bees happen to be around. This way everything stays inside the hive. Once again, it's very easy to go out and check on them and swap these out when you need to. Obviously, it's not for winter time because these would freeze, and that's where you need a candy board. And I'll be one of my projects that's going on right now in the shop here is I'm making some candy boards, and I'll be doing a video on those too. But if you got anything out of this, I appreciate getting a thumbs up. Of course, we're always looking for subscribers. Next to that subscribe button is a little bell. If you ring that bell, you'll be notified when we post another video. And I might even stick some more trivia now that you know where mason jars come from and you're familiar with John Laird Mason and not Perry Mason. See you on the next video.